You know what would be hilarious? Invite the help to the gala. Let her see what real elegance looks like. The laughter that followed was sharp. Rehearsed. The kind of laughter that sounds expensive and cuts like something cheap. Victoria stood at the center of her Fifth Avenue penthouse like a woman who had never been told no. Blonde hair sculpted into submission. A cream-colored Valentino draped over her shoulders as if the fabric itself was afraid to wrinkle. One hand resting on the marble countertop. The other wrapped around a mimosa she hadn't touched, because the glass was a prop, a scepter, a weapon she held just to remind you she could. Behind her, through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched out in every direction like something she owned. And in this world, the world of backroom deals, laundered fortunes, and men who made people disappear, she practically did. The plan was simple. Elegant, even, by Victoria's standards. She would invite Helen Thomas, the quiet black woman who scrubbed her floors, pressed her linens, and moved through the penthouse like a ghost no one bothered to look at, to the most exclusive charity gala in New York City. The annual Gotti Foundation benefit at the Plaza Hotel. Black tie. Crystal chandeliers. Manhattan's most powerful families brushing shoulders with senators' wives and men whose last names appeared in federal indictments. Helen would arrive in whatever sad, off-the-rack dress she could scrounge together. She would stand in the doorway looking exactly the way Victoria needed her to look, small, out of place, and reminded. And Victoria would be right there waiting. Champagne raised. Smirk loaded. That uppity maid needs to understand where she belongs, Victoria had told her inner circle 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to make sure she never forgets it. Everyone who mattered had been briefed. Not directly, of course, Victoria was far too polished for that. But a whisper here, a raised eyebrow there, a perfectly timed "you'll see tonight, darling. I've arranged a little entertainment," and the word spread through Park Avenue parlors and Long Island estates like smoke through silk. By the time the limousines began pulling up to the plaza's gilded entrance, every guest knew the script. Mobsters in hand-stitched tuxedos. Corrupt politicians with practiced smiles. Socialites whose charity was limited to writing checks that laundered the money their husbands stole. They gathered in the grand ballroom not just for cocktails and appearances, but for a show. Victoria's show. And the woman they were all waiting to laugh at had no idea she was the punchline. Or so they believed. In every mind in that ballroom, the scene had already played out. Helen would walk in wearing something forgettable, maybe a department store dress with the tag freshly cut, maybe shoes that clicked wrong on the marble. She would stand near the entrance, shoulders curving inward, eyes searching for a friendly face and finding none. Victoria would glide over, dripping with false kindness. "Oh, Helen, how brave of you to come." And the room would titter, and the hierarchy would be reinforced, and everyone would go home feeling taller for having watched someone else be made small. That was the plan. That was what was supposed to happen. Then the doors opened. The ballroom didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in a wave, table by table, conversation by conversation, like a power grid shutting down block by block across a city. First, the guests nearest the entrance. Their words simply stopped, mid-syllable, mid-laugh, mid-lie. Champagne flutes paused between table and lip. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere. Then the next row of tables. Then the next. Until the only sound in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was the whisper of sapphire blue silk trailing across white marble. Helen Thomas stood in the doorway. Except she didn't look like Helen Thomas. She looked like a queen who had temporarily misplaced her throne and had just come to collect it. The gown was emerald green, not the muted, safe green of something bought to blend in, but a deep, electric, almost impossible green that seemed to pull the light from the chandeliers and hold it against her skin like a secret. It hugged her frame with the kind of precision that whispered custom, couture, made for this body and no other. The bodice glittered with hand-sewn crystals so fine they looked like captured starlight. And from the waist, cascading behind her in a dramatic, sweeping wave, a sapphire blue train unfurled across the floor like a royal decree, bold, unapologetic, commanding every square inch of space it touched. Around her neck, diamonds. Not the kind you buy at a jeweler on Madison Avenue. The kind that have names. The kind that appear in auction catalogs with six-figure estimates and histories that trace back to old Hollywood, European royalty, and legacies that make billionaires wage bidding wars against each other across continents. The Montgomery diamonds, pieces that hadn't been seen in public since 1985, that most of the fashion world assumed were locked in a private vault somewhere, never to surface again. Helen moved through the ballroom the way candlelight moves through a dark room, slowly, inevitably, illuminating everything it touches. Her posture was flawless. Her chin was lifted. Her dark eyes swept the crowd with the calm, unhurried gaze of someone who already knew the ending of a story everyone else was just beginning to read. And she was smiling. Not a wide smile. Not a triumphant one. Just the smallest curve at the corners of her lips, the kind of smile worn by a woman who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down. Victoria saw her first. The smirk, the one she had been sharpening all evening, the one she had practiced in the mirror that morning, the one that was supposed to be the last thing Helen saw before being swallowed by humiliation, dissolved. It didn't fall. It evaporated, like frost under sudden heat. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came. The champagne flute in her right hand trembled, a tiny golden earthquake that sent a bead of mote rolling down the crystal and onto her knuckle. Her left hand drifted to her chest, not dramatically, not for show, but involuntarily, the way a body reaches for itself when it senses the ground shifting beneath it. Her face strained. Not of color exactly, Victoria was already pale, but of certainty. Of power. Of the absolute, unshakable belief that she was the most important woman in any room she entered. For the first time in her life, Victoria Gotti looked at her maid and did not see a maid. She saw something she didn't understand. And it terrified her. The whisper started at the edges of the room and moved inward like a tide. That dress. Is that the gown from the Sotheby's auction? The one that sold for $5 million. Those diamonds. My God, those are the Montgomery diamonds. That's impossible. The Montgomery collection hasn't been seen in decades. Wait, Montgomery? As in Richard Montgomery? The fashion mogul? An older woman at table 12, one of the few guests who remembered the world before the goddess had clawed their way into it, set down her glass with shaking hands and said, barely above a breath. That's not the maid. That's Richard Montgomery's daughter. The name moved through the ballroom like a lit fuse. John Gotti, standing near the bar in a charcoal suit with his top button undone, stopped mid-conversation. His jaw tightened. His dark eyes locked onto Helen with the cold, calculating focus of a man who had survived decades in the underworld by sensing danger before it arrived. He sensed it now. Something was very, very wrong. Victoria had designed this evening down to the last crystal ice sculpture. She had chosen the music, approved the guest list, rehearsed her cruelest lines. She had built tonight as a stage for one purpose, to break a woman she believed was beneath her. But as Helen Montgomery, crossed that marble floor in $5 million worth of emerald silk and legacy diamonds, the room understood something Victoria hadn't yet accepted. This was never going to be Helen's humiliation. This was going to be Victoria's reckoning. And the woman who had been invisible for 3 years was about to show every person in that ballroom exactly what she'd been doing in the dark. But to understand what happened next, to understand the dress, the diamonds, and the 3 years of silence that led to this single, devastating moment, you have to go back. Back to a brownstone in Harlem, 30 years ago. Back to a little girl sitting on the top stair in her pajamas, watching her mother pack a leather briefcase for court. Back to a brilliant attorney named Grace Montgomery who believed the law could protect the powerless from the powerful. Back to the night Grace was wrong. And back to the promise a grieving father whispered into his 8-year-old daughter's ear as they stood at a graveside in the rain. One day, sweetheart. One day, justice will find them. Helen had carried that promise for 3 decades. Tonight, she was delivering it. The gaudy penthouse woke up the same way every morning, with the smell of fresh espresso, the rustle of imported Italian newspapers, and the quiet, invisible labor of Helen Thomas making sure everything was perfect before anyone who mattered opened their eyes. She arrived at 6. Always 6. Let herself in through the service entrance on the side of the building, the one without cameras, the one that opened into a narrow hallway lined with mops and cleaning supplies and the faint smell of bleach. The doorman never greeted her. The elevator operator never looked up. 3 years of this, and Helen had become so invisible she sometimes wondered if the walls noticed her more than the people did. By 6:15, the espresso machine was hissing. By 6:30, the breakfast table was set, linen napkins folded into precise triangles, fresh fruit arranged by color because Victoria once threw a plate across the kitchen when the strawberries touched the melon. By 6:45, Helen was pressing John Gotti's newspaper with a warm iron to remove the creases, because John Gotti did not read wrinkled news. She did all of this without sound. Without complaint. Without existing. And she listened. John Gotti moved through his own home the way a general moves through a war room, slowly, deliberately, every step weighted with the understanding that people lived or stopped living based on his mood. He was not a large man, but he filled rooms. When he sat in his leather chair in the study, the chair didn't hold him, he held it. When he spoke on the phone, he never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The men on the other end of the line had seen what happened to people who made John repeat himself. He took his espresso black. 2 sugars. No conversation before 9. Helen knew this. Helen knew everything. She knew that the panic room behind the bookshelf in the study wasn't just for emergencies. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, 2 men in unmarked sedans arrived through the parking garage carrying duffel bags that smelled like ink and anxiety. Helen would be sent to the kitchen. Doors would close. But walls in old buildings are thinner than powerful men assume, and Helen had learned that $200,000 in mixed bills makes a very specific sound when it's being counted by hand. She knew the names. Caruso. De Luca. Bianchi. Ferraro. She knew which ones handled gambling, which ones handled construction kickbacks, and which one, Tommy Salerno, the one with the gold pinky ring and the nervous laugh, handled the things no one talked about in complete sentences. Victoria operated on the other side of the same dark coin. If John was the fist, Victoria was the glove, soft, elegant, and designed to make you forget what was underneath. She sat on the board of the Metropolitan Museum's Junior Council. She co-chaired charity luncheons for children's hospitals. She had brunch every Thursday with the wife of a sitting state senator, and every other Saturday she hosted a book club that had never, in 4 years, actually discussed a book. Her calendar was a masterpiece of performance. Every event attended, every dollar donated, every photo taken beside smiling politicians was a brick in the wall that separated the Gotti name from the Gotti reality. Victoria didn't launder money, she laundered reputation. And she was exceptionally good at it. Helen served it all. Poured the coffee at the brunches. Arranged the flowers for the fundraisers. Stood in the corner during the book clubs, refilling wine glasses and absorbing every whispered confession these women traded like currency. But it was the mornings in John's study that mattered most. On a Tuesday in late October, 16 days before the gala, Helen carried a silver tray of coffee into the study where John sat with 3 of his lieutenants. The room smelled like cigar smoke and cologne that cost more than Helen's monthly rent. Maps of Harlem were spread across the mahogany desk. Red circles marked specific blocks. Specific businesses. Helen set the tray down. Poured 4 cups. Not a single man looked at her. Marcus Williams, John said, tapping a red circle on 125th Street. The barber shop. He's 3 months behind. He says he can't pay, said Caruso, the oldest of the 3, his voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. Says business is down. Business is down, John repeated, the words flattened into something dangerous. Business is down because he's spending money on lawyers instead of paying what he owes. Somebody needs to explain to Mr. Williams that lawyers don't stop what's coming. They just make it more expensive. The men chuckled. Low. Practiced. Handle it, John said. Quietly. I don't want another Harlem situation making the papers. Not before Victoria's gala. Helen's hands didn't tremble. Her expression didn't shift. She set the sugar bowl on the table, collected the empty creamer, and walked out of the room carrying a tray, 4 names, an address on 125th Street, and a sentence that would later appear word for word in an FBI transcript. She stored everything. Every name. Every figure. Every location muttered between bites of prosciutto and sips of espresso. Her memory was a vault, and 3 years of service had filled it with enough evidence to collapse an empire. But memory wasn't enough. She needed proof. Victoria made sure Helen understood her place daily, though she would never have called it cruelty. She called it refinement. When you serve champagne, Helen, hold the bottle by the base. Not that you'd know champagne from apple juice, I'm sure. The silver needs polishing again. I can see fingerprints. Your fingerprints, presumably. Stand up straight when you're in the dining room, Helen. Posture matters. Even for staff. Each comment was delivered with a smile, the kind of smile that arrives gift-wrapped around contempt. Victoria never yelled. She didn't need to. Her cruelty was architectural, built into every interaction, every glance, every perfectly enunciated correction designed to remind Helen that the distance between them was not just professional but existential. Permanent. Written into the bones of the world. Helen absorbed it all. Nodded. Said, yes, Mrs. Gotti. Adjusted the bottle. Repolished the silver. Straightened her posture. And she waited. Because patience, Helen had learned, was not passive. Patience was the most aggressive thing a person could do when the alternative was acting too soon and losing everything. Her mother had taught her that. Her father had reinforced it. And the FBI case file growing thicker by the week confirmed it. Every insult was a countdown. Every correction brought her closer. On that same Tuesday night, long after John and Victoria had retired to their separate bedrooms on the 3rd floor, because the goddess hadn't shared a bed in years, another secret Helen kept, she moved through the darkened penthouse in stocking feet. No shoes. Shoes make sound. Sound makes questions. Questions make graves. John's study door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Because who would dare? The maid would dare. Helen pulled the leather-bound ledger from the 2nd drawer of the mahogany desk, the one with the brass lock that John thought was secure but that Helen had learned to pick in under 4 seconds using a hairpin and a steady hand. She opened it on the desk. Columns of numbers. Dates. Names. Amounts that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. From inside her cleaning caddy, nestled between a bottle of wood polish and a microfiber cloth, She removed a device that looked like a pen but wasn't. Micro camera. FBI issued. Capable of capturing documents in low light with crystal clarity. Click. 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 Page after page. Account after account. The entire nervous system of the gaudy financial empire, photographed in the dark by the woman they paid $14 an hour to dust their shelves. Helen closed the ledger. Returned it to the drawer. Locked it. Wiped the surface with a microfiber cloth, because Helen Thomas always left things cleaner than she found them. She slipped out of the study, through the kitchen, and out the service entrance into the cold October night, the camera warm in her pocket, the evidence secure, and the gala now 15 days away. 15 days. She could wait. She had waited 30 years. What was 15 more days to a woman who had already memorized the shape of her own justice? The brownstone on 138th Street smelled like cocoa butter and case law. Helen sat on the top stair in her pajamas, the ones with the little yellow butterflies that her father had bought from a boutique in Paris because Richard Montgomery didn't believe his daughter should wear anything that wasn't beautiful, even to sleep. She pressed her face between the wooden banisters and watched her mother move through the hallway below, heels clicking against the hardwood, leather briefcase in one hand, a stack of manila folders in the other. Grace Montgomery was the kind of woman who made rooms rearrange themselves when she entered. Tall. Elegant. Dark skin that caught the light like polished mahogany. She wore her hair natural, a crown of coils she refused to straighten despite every law firm that suggested otherwise, and she spoke the way she argued cases, precisely, fearlessly, and with the quiet understanding that the truth was a weapon most people were too afraid to use. "Mama?" Grace looked up. Smiled. That smile, wide, warm, anchored by something unshakable, was the thing Helen would spend the rest of her life trying to hold on to. "Baby, what are you doing up? It's past your bedtime. Are you going to win tomorrow?" Grace climbed 3 stairs, kissed Helen's forehead, and whispered, "I always win, sweetheart. Because I never fight for anything that isn't right." The case was enormous. 18 months of investigation. Exposed a network of mob-controlled extortion targeting black-owned businesses across Harlem and Brooklyn. Barbershops. Laundromats. Restaurants. Corner stores that had been in families for generations, squeezed dry by men in expensive suits who treated entire neighborhoods like ATMs. Grace had traced the money, identified the enforcers, and built a case so airtight that the district attorney called it the most significant organized crime prosecution in a decade. The name at the top of every document, the name Grace underlined 3 times in red ink, was Gotti. She knew the danger. Richard had begged her to step back, to let someone else carry the case forward. He had the money to disappear, mansions, offshore accounts, a fashion empire that stretched across 3 continents. They could vanish. Start over. Be safe. Grace refused. "If I stop, Richard, who starts? These families don't have the luxury of disappearing. They can't sell an empire and hide in Westchester. They're stuck. And if I don't fight for them, nobody will." Richard loved her for that. And it terrified him. 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, on a cold Tuesday evening in November, Grace Montgomery was killed on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 131st Street. The police called it a mugging. Random. Tragic. Wrong place, wrong time. The case file was thin. Suspiciously thin. 1 detective assigned. No witnesses located, despite the fact that it happened at 7 in the evening on a busy street. No suspects identified. The investigation was closed within 6 weeks. Random. Tragic. Case closed. Richard knew. He knew the way a man knows when the ground beneath him has been deliberately carved away, not because someone told him, but because the silence told him. The detective who wouldn't return his calls. The prosecutor who suddenly couldn't remember key details. The judge who retired unexpectedly 2 months later and moved to a gated community in Boca Raton paid for by money that didn't come from a pension. John Gotti had ordered the hit. Grace had gotten too close, and Gotti had done what Gotti always did, he removed the problem and made it look like weather. Just something that happened. Just the city being the city. Helen was 8 years old. She didn't understand the words her father said at the funeral. She didn't understand why the house got so quiet afterward, why the brownstone that used to smell like cocoa butter and case law now smelled like nothing at all. She didn't understand why her father sold Montgomery Fashion Group, the empire he had built from a single boutique in Soho into a global powerhouse, for a fraction of its worth and moved them to a stone estate in Westchester where the gate stayed closed and the phone stopped ringing. But she understood the promise. Richard made it on a rain-soaked afternoon in the cemetery, kneeling on the wet grass beside Grace's headstone, holding Helen's hand so tightly she could feel his heartbeat through his fingers. One day, sweetheart. One day, we'll make sure justice finds them. Helen grew up in that promise the way other children grow up in houses. It sheltered her. It shaped her. It gave her walls and a roof and a reason to wake up every morning in a home that felt emptied of everything except purpose. Richard didn't raise her to be angry. He raised her to be precise. By 14, Helen could read a financial ledger the way most teenagers read magazines, scanning for patterns, identifying discrepancies, tracing money through shell companies and phantom accounts. Richard taught her himself, sitting across from her at the dining table with documents spread between them like a war room in miniature. By 18, she understood the architecture of organized crime, not from textbooks, but from her father's obsessive, decades-long study of the family that destroyed his wife. The Gotti network. The legitimate businesses that fronted illegal operations. The politicians who were bought. The cops who stayed blind. The prosecutors who forgot. By 22, Helen had a plan. She would become invisible. She would enter the Gotti household not as Helen Montgomery, heiress, daughter of a murdered civil rights attorney, a name that might trigger recognition, but as Helen Thomas. A quiet woman from Brooklyn with a fabricated background, a clean record, and a willingness to scrub floors for $14 an hour. The preparation took 3 years before she ever set foot in the penthouse. She changed her name legally. Built a paper trail, rental history, prior employment at a cleaning agency in Queens, references from people who didn't exist but whose phone numbers connected to FBI-monitored lines. She cut ties with every social connection that might link her to the Montgomery name. She moved into a small apartment in Bed-Stuy, furnished with second-hand furniture and a single-framed photograph she kept face down in a drawer except on the nights when the weight of what she was doing pressed down hard enough to crack bone. The photograph was Grace. Standing on the courthouse steps in Harlem, briefcase in hand, head tilted slightly upward, as if she were looking at something above the skyline that no one else could see. Justice, maybe. Or the future she believed in. Or the daughter who would one day finish what she started. Helen applied for the maid position on a Wednesday. Victoria hired her on the spot, barely glanced at her references, didn't ask a single meaningful question. Why would she? Helen was exactly what Victoria expected a maid to be, quiet, black, deferential, and easy to overlook. Perfect, Helen had thought as she accepted the starched uniform and the list of household rules. Absolutely perfect. That was 3 years ago. Now, on this October night, 15 days before the gala, 6 hours after photographing John Gotti's financial ledgers in his own study, Helen sat on the edge of her bed in the Bed-Stuy apartment. The city hummed outside her window. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance, thin and mournful, the sound of someone else's emergency fading into the dark. She reached into the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out the photograph. Held it under the lamplight. Traced her thumb across her mother's face, the high cheekbones, the natural hair, the expression that said "I am not afraid of you" without ever needing to say it aloud. Helen's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She had stopped crying years ago. Tears were a luxury for people who hadn't yet decided what to do with their grief. Helen had decided a long time ago. She pressed the photograph to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered into the silence of her apartment, into the silence that had followed her since she was 8 years old, since the brownstone stopped smelling like cocoa butter and case law, since the world took the bravest woman she knew and called at random. "I'm close now, Mama. So close." The photograph went back in the drawer. Face down. Protected. Helen turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, counting the days the way her father had taught her to count everything, patiently, precisely, and with the absolute certainty that the number would eventually reach 0. 14 days now. 14 days until Victoria Gotti handed her the stage. And Helen Montgomery would bring the whole house down. I know you're dying to see what happens next. If you're loving this suspense, check the pinned comment and the story description to support the channel. 2 weeks out, and Victoria Gotti was in her element. The penthouse dining table, the one Helen polished every morning until she could see her own reflection in the mahogany, had been transformed into a command center. Fabric swatches fanned across the surface like a dealer's hand. Seating charts covered in Victoria's sharp handwriting. Mood boards pinned with photographs of ice sculptures, floral arrangements, and lighting schemes that cost more than most people's annual salaries. 3 event coordinators sat across from Victoria, nodding in synchronized terror as she dissected every detail of the gala with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a scalpel. The ice sculpture will be a swan. Not an abstract swan, a realistic swan. I want people to feel like it might fly off the table. And the orchestra, strings only for the first hour. No brass until after the entree. Brass before dinner is vulgar. The coordinator scribbled furiously. No one disagreed with Victoria Gotti. Not about swans. Not about brass. Not about anything. Helen moved through the room refilling water glasses, invisible as furniture, her ears cataloging every name Victoria mentioned for the guest list. City Councilman Ferraro. Judge Patterson. The Caruso family. The DeLucas. Names Helen already knew from ledgers and late-night phone calls, names that belonged in handcuffs, not on embossed invitations. She waited for the pause. The natural lull in Victoria's monologue when she reached for her sparkling water and surveyed the table like a general reviewing a battlefield. "Mrs. Gotti," Helen said, her voice quiet, deferential, perfectly calibrated. "If I may, I noticed Commissioner Hartley's wife attended last year's Metropolitan Gala. She mentioned how much she admired your event planning. Perhaps an invitation would be a lovely gesture." Victoria's eyes narrowed, then softened. Commissioner Hartley was dirty. Helen knew this because she'd photographed the envelopes of cash John sent to his office every month, but to Victoria, his wife was simply another trophy guest. Another name to elevate the evening. And perhaps the Bianchi family? Helen continued, refilling Victoria's glass with the exact pour she'd been taught. Their donation to the Children's Hospital last year was quite generous. The Bianchis ran the Gotti family's money laundering operation through a chain of car washes in Staten Island. Their generosity was measured in felonies. Victoria tilted her head, studying Helen with the expression of a woman watching a dog perform an unexpected trick. "These are excellent ideas, Helen. Perhaps you're learning something after all." Helen lowered her eyes. "I learn from watching you, Mrs. Gotti." Victoria smiled, pleased, preening, utterly unaware that she had just invited the final pieces of a federal indictment to her own party. That evening, Helen sat in a cracked vinyl booth at the Olympia Diner in Astoria, Queens, a place where the coffee tasted like regret and nobody remembered faces. Across from her, FBI Special Agent Sarah Daniels stirred a cup she had no intention of drinking and studied the documents Helen slid across the table inside a folded newspaper. Photographs of financial ledgers. Dates. Account numbers. Transcribed conversations from John's study. A list of every guest Helen had maneuvered onto the gala invitation list and the specific federal charges each one faced. Agent Daniels flipped through the pages slowly, her expression professional, but her eyes betraying something close to awe. Helen, this is 3 years of airtight prosecution in a manila envelope. It's not enough, Helen said. Not if they scatter. You arrest John at home, the lieutenants disappear. You raid the businesses, the politicians claim ignorance. You need them together. All of them. In one room. On one night. Daniels looked up. The gala. The gala. A silence settled between them, weighted with the gravity of what they were building. Daniels leaned forward, lowering her voice even though the nearest patron was an elderly man asleep over a bowl of soup 3 booths away. We'll have agents positioned throughout the plaza. Waitstaff. Security. Guests. Every exit covered, every face identified. When you give the signal, we move. She paused. You understand what this means, Helen. Once we go, there's no unwinding it. Your cover is gone. Your life as Helen Thomas is over. Helen's fingers wrapped around her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her, steadying the thing inside her chest that sometimes trembled when she thought too hard about what she was doing. Helen Thomas was never real, she said quietly. It's time for her to stop existing. Daniels held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. The kind of nod between soldiers. 2 weeks, Daniels said. 2 weeks, Helen confirmed. She left the diner through the back entrance, as always, disappearing into the Queen's night like smoke. The drive to Westchester took 47 minutes. Helen hadn't visited the estate in 3 months, too risky, too many variables, too much chance that someone might notice the gaudy family's maid driving a borrowed car through the gates of a property that property records showed belonged to a ghost. But tonight the risk was necessary. Tonight was the last piece. The Montgomery estate sat behind a wall of old oaks at the end of a private road that didn't appear on GPS. The house was stone and ivy, the kind of house that whispered old money without ever raising its voice. Most of the rooms were dark. Most of the rooms had been dark for decades. Richard Montgomery met her at the door. He was 73 now. Thinner than Helen remembered from even 3 months ago, his once powerful frame settling into the architecture of age. But his eyes, dark, sharp, ferociously intelligent, hadn't dimmed. They were Grace's eyes, the same ones Helen saw in her own mirror every morning, and they studied his daughter now with a tenderness so deep it bordered on grief. You look tired, he said. I'm fine, Daddy. You look tired, he repeated, because Richard Montgomery had never accepted a lie from anyone, least of all the person he loved most in the world. He led her through the darkened hallway to his study, the one room in the house that still blazed with life. Books lined every wall. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. And on the mahogany desk, laid out with the reverence of a sacred artifact, was the dress. Helen stopped in the doorway. The gown lay across the desk like a living thing, emerald green silk so deep it looked like it had been woven from the last light before nightfall. The sapphire blue train pulled off the edge of the desk and cascaded toward the floor in folds so fluid they seemed to breathe. And beside it, resting on a bed of black velvet, the Montgomery diamonds caught the firelight and scattered it across the ceiling in tiny, trembling constellations. Helen's breath left her. Your mother wore these once, Richard said, his voice rough at the edges, the words carrying the weight of 30 years of silence. The night I told her I loved her. She stood on the balcony of the Plaza Hotel, the very same building, and she wore this dress, and every person in the room forgot how to speak. He paused, steadying himself. Now you'll wear them for her. Helen touched the fabric. The silk was cool beneath her fingers, impossibly soft, alive with a history that hummed like a low current. Her mother's dress. Her mother's diamonds. Her mother's unfinished fight, folded and waiting. Daddy. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal the girl still living inside the woman. What if something goes wrong? What if Victoria, what if it's not enough? Richard crossed the room. Took both her hands. His grip was steady in the way that only a man who has already lost everything and survived can be steady. You are Grace's daughter, he said, his eyes locked on hers, unwavering. You've already won. They just don't know it yet. Helen held his gaze. Let the words settle. Let them find the place inside her where doubt lived and fill it with something older and stronger, something inherited, something earned, something that had been sharpened on 3 decades of patience and was now, finally, ready. She dressed in the guest room on the 2nd floor. Alone. The gown slipped on like a second skin, like it had been waiting for her, like it remembered the shape of a Montgomery woman and had kept the memory safe all these years. She fastened the diamonds around her neck with steady hands. Adjusted the sapphire train. Smoothed the emerald bodice. Then she turned to the full-length mirror. The woman who looked back was not Helen Thomas. Helen Thomas scrubbed floors. Helen Thomas said yes, Mrs. Gaudy and polished silver and moved through rooms like a ghost. Helen Thomas was a disguise, a tool, a 3-year performance played flawlessly on a stage built by grief. The woman in the mirror was someone else entirely. She stood tall, shoulders back, chin lifted, dark eyes burning with a quiet fire that no amount of hold the bottle by the base could ever extinguish. The emerald gown caught the lamplight and held it the way her mother's skin used to hold the sun. The diamonds blazed at her throat like a declaration. The sapphire train swept the floor behind her, regal and unapologetic, claiming space the way Grace Montgomery had always claimed space, not by asking for it, but by deserving it so completely that the room had no choice but to rearrange itself around her. Helen Montgomery. Daughter of Grace. Daughter of Richard. Heir to an empire that had been hidden, not lost. Carrier of a promise made in the rain over a grave that should never have been dug. She stared at her reflection and felt the last tremor of doubt leave her body like smoke through an open window. 13 days. In 13 days, she would walk through the doors of the Plaza Hotel and end the gaudy empire with the same weapon they never expected and never defended against. The truth. Helen turned from the mirror. Removed the gown. Folded it carefully. Placed the diamonds back on their velvet bed. Kissed her father goodnight. And drove back to Brooklyn in the dark, steady as a clock counting down to 0. The morning of the gala, Victoria Gaudy woke up happy. This was unusual. Victoria didn't do happy, she did satisfied, she did superior, she did vindicated. But today, on this particular Saturday in November, she allowed herself the indulgence of genuine, uncomplicated joy. The kind of joy that comes from knowing you are about to destroy someone and that every detail of their destruction has been personally curated by your own hand. She was out of bed by 7, which was unheard of. By 7:30, she had already reduced one hairstylist to tears, sent back a makeup artist for bringing the wrong shade of foundation, "Do I look beige to you?" and fired a florist over the phone for suggesting white roses instead of ivory. Ivory is elegance. White is a hospital. Do I need to explain everything? The penthouse hummed with frantic energy. Garment bags hung from every door frame. 3 pairs of shoes lined the hallway outside the master bedroom, each one auditioned and rejected before Victoria settled on custom Louboutins with hand-sewn crystal detailing that caught the light like tiny knives. Helen served breakfast at 8. Eggs Benedict with smoked salmon, fresh squeezed grapefruit juice, and coffee so precise in its preparation that Victoria once made Helen remake it 4 times in a single morning because the phone was aggressive. Today, Victoria didn't critique the coffee. She was too excited. She sat at the breakfast table in her silk robe, flipping through the finalized guest list with the delight of a child reviewing Christmas presents. Every name a trophy. Every confirmed RSVP a validation of her power, her taste, her position at the center of a world that feared her husband and adored the version of herself she performed for them. Helen set the plate down. Poured the juice. Stood back. Victoria looked up, and her smile sharpened into something that had teeth. Do try not to embarrass yourself tonight, Helen. Though I suppose that's inevitable. She laughed, that bright, brittle laugh that filled rooms the way perfume fills an elevator, inescapable and slightly suffocating. I've laid out something for you to wear. It's in the service closet. Nothing extravagant, of course, we wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed. Helen glanced at the service closet. She already knew what was inside. A plain black dress, 2 sizes too large, purchased from a discount retailer. Victoria had shown it to her friends last week, holding it up like a prop in a comedy routine. They had laughed until their champagne went flat. Thank you, Mrs. Gotti, Helen said. That's very thoughtful. Victoria's smile widened. She had no idea that the words were a eulogy for everything she believed about herself. Helen left the penthouse at noon. Took the service elevator down. Walked 6 blocks to the subway. Rode the Q train to Brooklyn in silence, her reflection ghosting across the darkened windows as Manhattan disappeared behind her. The apartment in Bed-Stuy was quiet. Sunlight came through the window in pale, angular slices, falling across the bed where the garment bag lay like a sleeping thing. Helen locked the door. Drew the curtains. And began. She showered first. Took her time. Let the water run hot enough to loosen every knot that 3 years of yes, Mrs. Gotti had tied into her shoulders. She dried off slowly, deliberately, the way a soldier prepares before a mission, every movement intentional, every breath counted. Hair first. She sat before the small vanity mirror she'd bought at a thrift store and worked her natural curls into sculpted waves that framed her face like a crown. No stylist. No salon. Just her hands, her mother's techniques, and the muscle memory of a woman who had grown up watching Grace Montgomery turn a bathroom mirror into a throne room. Makeup next. Subtle but deliberate. A smokiness around the eyes that deepened their intensity. Cheekbones highlighted to catch every chandelier in the plaza. Lips painted in a shade of deep berry that Grace used to wear on court days, her war paint, she'd called it, laughing. Helen wasn't laughing. But she understood the term now. Then the dress. She unzipped the garment bag and let the emerald silk spill out like water finding its level. It pulled across her bed, shimmering, alive with the same energy it had carried in her father's study. The sapphire train followed, cascading over the edge of the mattress and onto the floor. The Montgomery diamonds sat in their velvet case on the nightstand, waiting. Helen dressed with ceremony. The gown slipped on and the world shifted, the apartment walls fell away, the thrift store furniture dissolved, the subway rumble outside faded into nothing. The woman in the discount store mirror wasn't standing in Bed-Stuy anymore. She was standing in the future. The one she had built with 3 years of silence and 30 years of grief. The knock came at exactly 5:30. She opened the door, and Richard Montgomery stood in the hallway in a charcoal suit she hadn't seen in decades, the one he'd worn to the last public event he ever attended, the night before Grace died. His eyes were wet before he even looked at her, and when he did, when he saw his daughter standing in his wife's dress with his wife's diamonds blazing at her throat, the sound he made wasn't a word. It was something older than language. Something that lived in the space between pride and heartbreak. "Your mother," he said, his voice barely holding, "would be so proud." Helen took his arm. Squeezed it once. Hard. They didn't speak again until they reached the car. Across Manhattan, the Plaza Hotel was becoming a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers, 12 of them, each one worth more than most apartments in the city, threw fractured light across a ballroom that had been transformed into Victoria's vision of perfection. Ivory roses erupted from gold vases on every table. An orchestra tuned their instruments behind a curtain of white silk. Ice sculptures, realistic swans, naturally, guarded each end of the buffet like frozen sentinels. The marble floors had been polished until they reflected the ceiling, creating the illusion that guests were walking on air, or on the surface of very expensive water. Every surface gleamed. Every detail whispered money, power, and the kind of taste that is really just wealth wearing a better outfit. Outside, limousines lined up along Central Park South like a motorcade for an empire that would never appear on any map. Doors opened. Heels clicked. Manhattan's elite emerged into the November night in clouds of perfume and entitlement, flashbulbs popping as society photographers captured every arrival. Victoria and John Gotti entered at 7:15. She wore cream, always cream, her signature, the color of innocence she performed so well. A custom Oscar de la Renta that hugged her frame and flared at the knee, dripping with hand-sewn pearls that trembled when she walked. Her blonde hair was swept into an architectural updo that added 3 inches to her height and approximately 0 warmth to her expression. John walked beside her in black Armani, his collar open at the throat, his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who knew that every person in the room owed him something: money, loyalty, silence, or their life. Photographers called their names. Victoria posed. John didn't. They entered the ballroom like a king and queen returning to a court they had built with blood and bookkeeping. Victoria immediately began holding court. She moved from table to table, air-kissing cheeks, squeezing forearms, dropping hints about the evening's entertainment with the restrained glee of a woman who has wrapped a cruel joke in expensive paper and can't wait for everyone to open it. "You'll see," she told the senator's wife, touching her arm conspiratorially. "Let's just say we'll all be reminded of how fortunate we are tonight. I've arranged something special," she whispered to the museum board chair. A little lesson in knowing one's place. The laughter that followed each hint was polite, anticipatory, hungry. These people hadn't come just for champagne and tax-deductible donations. They'd come for blood. Victoria's particular brand of social blood, the kind that doesn't stain gowns but ruins lives. What none of them noticed, not Victoria, not John, not the senators or the socialites or the men whose names appeared in the ledgers Helen had photographed, were the strangers. The bartender with the military short haircut and the earpiece barely concealed beneath his collar. The woman in the silver evening gown near the east wall who held her clutch with both hands because her clutch contained a federal badge and a Glock 19. The 3 men in tuxedos stationed at the service exits who hadn't touched their champagne. The security guard by the main entrance whose credentials, if checked closely, listed an employer that didn't exist. 17 FBI agents. Embedded in the ballroom like mines in a field of flowers. Agent Sarah Daniels stood near the orchestra, dressed in a midnight blue gown that she had complained about for 3 days during briefings. "I'm a federal agent, not a debutante," but wore now with the composed stillness of a woman who understood that tonight's operation was the largest coordinated arrest in the Bureau's organized crime division in 11 years. She adjusted her concealed earpiece with a gesture that looked like tucking hair behind her ear. "All units in position," she murmured. Waiting for the signal. The ballroom was full now. Every chair occupied. Every glass filled. Mobsters in hand-stitched tuxedos. Corrupt politicians with campaign smiles. Dirty cops whose badges sat in their jacket pockets next to phones that contained text messages they would deeply regret. Socialites whose diamonds were purchased with money that had been washed so many times it practically smelled like detergent. Every person Helen had carefully, methodically, over 3 years, placed on a list. All of them. In one room. On one night. Victoria positioned herself at the entrance to the ballroom, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by her 4 closest friends, women who competed for her approval the way planets orbit a sun, desperately and without choice. She faced the grand double doors, her posture perfect, her smile loaded, her cruelty coiled and ready. She should be arriving any moment, Victoria said, checking the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist. I told her 8 o'clock. The help is always punctual, I'll give her that. The friends laughed. The photographers adjusted their lenses, sensing something about to happen. The orchestra finished their warm-up and fell silent. The ballroom seemed to inhale, a collective breath held by 300 people who had been promised a spectacle. 8 o'clock arrived. Victoria's eyes fixed on the grand double doors. Her smirk settled into place, rehearsed, perfected, aimed. A murmur rippled through the crowd near the entrance. Heads began to turn. A photographer lowered his camera and stared. Victoria's smirk sharpened. Here we go. The doors opened. And Helen stepped into the light. Well, well, well. Look who decided to show up. I didn't think you'd actually have the nerve. Victoria's voice cut across the entrance like a blade wrapped in silk, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, sharp enough to draw the first wave of attention she had been craving all evening. Her champagne flute was raised at the perfect angle, not to drink, but to gesture, to punctuate, to remind everyone watching that she held the power in this room the way she held that glass, casually, elegantly, and with the absolute confidence that it would never be taken from her. She was already laughing when she turned fully toward the doors. Then she saw her. And the laugh died in her throat like a candle in a hurricane. Helen stood in the doorway of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, and the world stopped. Not figuratively. Not poetically. The world, this world, Victoria's world, the world of crystal and corruption and carefully maintained hierarchies, stopped. The way a heart stops before it either beats again or doesn't. The way a clock stops when something fundamental inside it breaks. The gown came first. That was what the eyes found before the brain could process anything else, the emerald green, so deep and vivid it seemed to generate its own light, as if the silk had been soaked in something luminous and ancient. The bodice was fitted with a precision that spoke of hands that had measured not just a body but a legacy, every crystal hand-sewn, every seam invisible, every curve of the fabric following the curve of the woman inside it with the kind of devotion that couture reserves for its rarest creations. It wasn't worn. It was inhabited. And then the train. Sapphire blue, cascading from the waist in a sweeping, dramatic fall that pulled behind Helen like a royal declaration written in silk. It moved when she moved, not following her, but flowing with her, as if the fabric understood the assignment and had committed to it completely. It caught the light from 12 crystal chandeliers and scattered it across the marble floor in ripples of blue and white, turning the entrance of the ballroom into something that looked less like a doorway and more like the opening scene of a story the room wasn't prepared to hear. The diamonds were last. And they were the thing that broke the silence into whispers. The Montgomery diamonds sat against Helen's collarbone like they had been forged there, a cascade of stones so brilliant they didn't just reflect light, they argued with it, bending and fracturing every beam from every chandelier into tiny explosions of fire that danced across Helen's dark skin like stars refusing to stay in the sky. The centerpiece, a flawless, 11-carat diamond surrounded by a halo of sapphires, rested in the hollow of her throat, rising and falling with each breath, patient and blazing and unmistakable. The ballroom's reaction didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a wave breaks, starting at the shore and pulling everything backward. The guests nearest the entrance went first. A woman in red chiffon stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still shaped around a word she would never finish. Her companion turned to see what she was staring at, and his champagne glass froze 3 inches from his lips, suspended there, forgotten, irrelevant. A photographer who had been adjusting his lens looked up, and his finger found the shutter button by instinct alone because his brain had temporarily stopped sending instructions to his hands. Then the next table. A banker in a $4,000 suit set down his fork with a clink that sounded like a gunshot in the growing silence. His wife gripped his arm. The couple beside them turned. Then the next. Then the next. The silence spread like ice across water, quick, inevitable, cracking through conversations and laughter and the comfortable noise of wealth performing for itself until the only sound in the grand ballroom was the whisper of sapphire silk trailing across white marble and the soft, steady click of Helen's heels. She moved through the room the way light moves through a cathedral, slowly, deliberately, illuminating everything it touches and making no apology for what it reveals. Her posture was immaculate. Her shoulders were back, her chin lifted at an angle that wasn't arrogance but something more dangerous, certainty. The certainty of a woman who had spent 3 years with her head bowed and was now, finally, lifting it. Her expression was serene. Not smiling. Not gloating. Just present, fully, completely, devastatingly present in a way that Helen Thomas, the maid, had never been allowed to be. Her dark eyes swept the room with the unhurried calm of someone reading the final page of a story she had written herself, and when those eyes found Victoria's, they didn't flinch. They didn't waver. They settled on her the way a verdict settles on a courtroom. Victoria's face was a masterpiece of collapse. The smirk went first, dissolving so fast it left a ghost of itself on her lips, a muscle memory of cruelty that her face was still trying to perform even as the rest of her understood that the performance was over. The color went next, draining from her cheeks in a slow, visible retreat that left her skin the same shade as the cream gown she had chosen so carefully that morning. Her champagne glass trembled. A single drop of moat crested the rim and slid down the crystal, catching the light on its way to her knuckle, a tiny, golden tear shed by a glass that understood the moment better than the woman holding it. Her lips parted. No sound. Her friends, the 4 women who had positioned themselves around her like satellites, ready to laugh on cue, ready to echo whatever cruelty Victoria unleashed, exchanged glances. Not knowing glances. Confused glances. The kind of look shared by people who showed up to watch a boxing match and realized they were standing in the ring. The whispers began at the edges and moved inward like a tide. Is that? Those diamonds. My God. That's the dress from the Sotheby's auction. The emerald gown. It sold for $5 million. $5 million. But those stones, those are the Montgomery diamonds. I'd recognize that centerpiece anywhere. My mother bid on those in '86. Montgomery? That's impossible. The Montgomery collection vanished decades ago. Wait. Wait. Montgomery. As in Richard Montgomery? The name moved through the ballroom like voltage through a wire. It reached the older guests first, the ones who remembered a time before the goddess had clawed their way to the top, a time when the Montgomery name meant fashion empires and philanthropic galas and a couple so glamorous they made the Kennedys look understated. A silver-haired woman at table 9 pressed her hand to her mouth. A retired magazine editor near the bar whispered to her companion with the urgency of someone witnessing a resurrection. John Gotti stood 15 feet from the bar, a glass of scotch in his right hand, his left hand resting against the lapel of his Armani jacket. He hadn't moved since Helen appeared. hadn't spoken. His face revealed nothing, it never did. John Gotti had survived 40 years in the underworld by ensuring his face was the last thing to betray him, but his eyes had narrowed to dark, calculating slits. The eyes of a predator who has just heard a sound in the grass that doesn't belong. He was doing the math. And the math wasn't adding up. Helen crossed the final stretch of marble between the entrance and the place where Victoria stood rooted to the floor. The sapphire train whispered behind her, a sound like breath, like patience, like 30 years of silence finally exhaling. She stopped 3 feet from Victoria. Close enough to speak without raising her voice. Close enough to see the vein pulsing at Victoria's temple. Close enough to smell the Chanel No. 5 that Victoria wore like armor and that now smelled, somehow, like defeat. Helen's voice was clear. Steady. Unhurried. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because the truth doesn't require rehearsal. Thank you for the invitation, Victoria. It was very generous of you. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Every ear in the ballroom caught them. Every guest held their breath. Victoria's mouth worked. Her jaw moved, but the machinery behind it, the quick, cruel wit, the razor-edged composure, the social instincts that had carried her through decades of performing grace she didn't possess, had jammed. Broken. Overloaded by a reality that didn't match any script she had ever written. This is. Her voice came out shrill, stripped of its usual polish, cracking at the edges like cheap lacquer. Where did you get that dress? Not how dare you. Not who do you think you are. Just where did you get that dress? The question of a woman whose brain had latched onto the only concrete detail it could process because everything else was too enormous to hold. Helen's answer was soft. Almost gentle. The gentleness of a final door closing. It belonged to my mother. She wore it once, many years ago. The word mother detonated quietly. It moved through the crowd like a tremor, not the violent, obvious kind, but the deep, structural kind that precedes the collapse of buildings. Guests who had been whispering the Montgomery name now whispered it louder. Phones emerged from clutches and jacket pockets. Texts flew to editors, producers, gossip columnists, and the one society reporter from Vanity Fair who was already drafting a headline in her head. And then someone shouted it. From somewhere near the middle of the ballroom, later, no one could agree on exactly who, a voice rang out with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty church. That's Helen Montgomery. That's Richard Montgomery's daughter. The room erupted. Not into chaos, not yet, but into the electric, buzzing, disbelieving energy of 300 people simultaneously realizing that the ground beneath them has shifted and the woman they had all agreed to laugh at tonight is standing in $5 million worth of emerald silk and legacy diamonds and is not, has never been, will never be, the person they were told she was. Victoria stood frozen. Her champagne glass had tilted sideways in her hand, the last of the moat running down her wrist and dripping onto the marble floor in soft, golden splashes that no one noticed and no one cleaned up. Her eyes were locked on Helen's. And in those eyes, Victoria's pale, panicked, uncomprehending eyes, Helen saw something she had waited 3 years to see. Fear. Not the performative fear of a society wife worried about a stain on her reputation. Real fear. The bone-deep, animal-brain fear of a woman who has suddenly understood that she is not the predator in this room. She is the prey. And the trap she built for someone else has just closed around her own throat. Helen held Victoria's gaze. Didn't blink. Didn't smile. Didn't need to. The power shift wasn't subtle. It wasn't gradual. It was seismic, a complete, irreversible transfer that every person in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom felt in their chest, in their spine, in the part of their brain that recognizes when the rules of the world have just been rewritten by someone who was never supposed to hold the pen. Victoria's cruel plan hadn't collapsed. It had been replaced. And the woman who replaced it was still standing 3 feet away, emerald and sapphire and diamond, patient as a promise kept, calm as the truth always is when it finally arrives. I know you're dying to see what happens next. If you're loving this suspense, check the pinned comment and the story description to support the channel. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of Victoria Gotti standing in the wreckage of her own evening, champagne dripping from her wrist, her brain scrambling to reassemble a reality that had just been detonated in front of 300 witnesses and a growing number of camera phones. Then the silence broke, and Victoria broke with it. This is ridiculous. Her voice came out too loud. Too high. It cracked through the ballroom like a champagne flute thrown against marble, sharp, jagged, impossible to ignore and impossible to put back together. Every guest who had been whispering snapped to attention. Every camera that had been discreetly angled toward Helen pivoted to capture the woman who was now visibly, publicly, catastrophically losing control. She's the help. The maid. Victoria's arm swept outward, gesturing at Helen with the desperate energy of a woman trying to point at something that no one else could see anymore. Her voice climbed another register, abandoning the careful modulation she had spent decades perfecting, the voice that charmed museum directors and senators' wives and charity boards, replacing it with something raw and exposed and ugly. I don't know what kind of costume this is, what kind of trick, but this woman scrubs my toilets. She folds my laundry. I was your maid. Helen's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved through the ballroom the way a blade moves through silk, without resistance, without effort, cutting cleanly through Victoria's hysteria and leaving silence in its wake. That part is true. 4 words. Delivered with a calm so absolute it made Victoria's shrieking sound like what it was, the noise a person makes when they realize the ground beneath them is no longer solid. Victoria's face contorted. The mask, the one she had worn for 20 years, the one made of Chanel and charity galas and practiced smiles that never reached her eyes, didn't just slip. It shattered. Completely. Publicly. Irreversibly. What emerged from underneath was something the guests at the plaza had never seen and would never forget: Victoria Gotti, stripped of performance, reduced to the raw, thrashing fury of a woman who has been outplayed and knows it. She lunged. It happened fast, faster than anyone expected from a woman in 4-inch Louboutins and a pearl-encrusted Oscar de la Renta. Victoria surged forward, champagne flute raised above her shoulder like a weapon, her teeth bared, a sound coming from her throat that was less word than animal, guttural, desperate, the sound of power recognizing its own extinction. You're nothing. 2 security guards caught her before the glass reached its target. Their hands closed around her arms with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to controlling volatile situations, but even they seemed startled by the force of her. Victoria twisted against their grip, her updo collapsing, pearl-tipped pins scattering across the marble like tiny surrenders. Nothing but hired help. How dare you come here, Anne? Ma'am, please. Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my husband is? The words echoed through the ballroom with the particular hollowness of a threat that everyone present understood had just lost its power. Victoria screamed them anyway, because screaming was all she had left, because the machinery of intimidation that had sustained her for decades was seizing, grinding, failing, and the only tool remaining in her arsenal was volume. Helen hadn't moved. Not 1 inch. Not 1 flinch. She stood exactly where Victoria's lunge had been aimed, 3 feet from the epicenter of the meltdown, and she was untouched. Perfectly still. The emerald gown catching the light. The Montgomery diamonds blazing at her throat. Her expression carrying the devastating composure of a woman who had anticipated every moment of this and had chosen, deliberately, to let it happen. She didn't need to fight Victoria. She just needed to stand still and let Victoria fight herself. The crowd's reaction shifted in real time. The initial shock, gasps, covered mouths, the instinctive recoil of people witnessing something they weren't prepared for, gave way to something more complex. Discomfort. Embarrassment. The particular squirming unease of watching a person you once feared reveal themselves as someone you pity. Guests who had spent years courting Victoria's approval now looked away. Women who had laughed at her jokes about the help studied their manicures. Men who had kissed her cheek at fundraisers suddenly found the ice sculptures fascinating. The isolation was instantaneous. Complete. The room didn't turn on Victoria, it simply stopped holding her up. John Gotti moved. He crossed the ballroom with the measured stride of a man who had controlled rooms for decades, his face set in the granite expression that had terrified rivals, silenced witnesses, and ended conversations with a look. He placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder, not comforting, not gentle, but controlling. A handler managing an asset that had become a liability. Victoria. Enough. His voice was low. Commanding. The voice of a man accustomed to being the last word in every room. But tonight, in this room, his authority landed differently. It didn't silence the crowd, it reminded them that the man trying to restore order was the same man whose name appeared in the ledgers, the same man whose phone calls Helen had catalogued, the same man who had ordered a hit on a civil rights attorney 30 years ago and called it random. His command felt hollow. A king issuing decrees in a kingdom that had already fallen. Helen watched John pull Victoria back. Watched the security guards release her. Watched Victoria sag against her husband's arm, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark rivers that ruined the face she had spent 3 hours perfecting that morning. Then Helen turned to face the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The ballroom was so silent that the soft rustle of her sapphire train against the marble sounded like thunder. For 3 years, she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner, every table, every ear that had ever dismissed her as background noise, I worked in the Gotti household. She let the sentence breathe. I served dinner. Folded laundry. Polished silverware. Pressed newspapers. Poured coffee for men who planned extortion over breakfast. Arranged flowers for women who discussed which families to destroy over brunch. Her eyes moved across the room, not scanning, but addressing. Meeting individual gazes. Holding them. One by one, table by table, forcing each person to see her the way they had refused to see her for 3 years. I was invisible to you all. The word hung in the chandelier light. But invisible doesn't mean blind. A pause. Precise. Invisible doesn't mean deaf. Another pause. Devastating. And invisible certainly doesn't mean powerless. The room absorbed the words the way skin absorbs a burn, slowly, painfully, with the growing understanding that the damage is deeper than the surface. Helen's gaze swept toward the tables where the men in expensive tuxedos sat with their wives and their mistresses and their laundered fortunes. The men whose names she had memorized. The men whose crimes she had documented. The men who had sat in John Gotti's study discussing which businesses to crush, which witnesses to silence, which neighborhoods to bleed dry, all while a woman they didn't bother to look at refilled their coffee and recorded every word. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The shell companies in Delaware. The construction contracts rigged through City Hall. A man at table 4 shifted in his chair. His wife grabbed his arm. I know about the protection rackets in Harlem and Brooklyn. The barbershop on 125th Street. The bakery on Fulton. The families you bankrupted because they believed they had the right to run their own businesses without paying tribute to men who never built anything, only took. Councilman Ferraro's face went gray. He reached for his water glass and missed. I know about the lives you've ruined. The witnesses you've intimidated. The evidence you've buried. The people who disappeared. The word disappeared moved through the room like a cold front, temperature dropping, spine stiffening, the comfortable warmth of denial evaporating from every guilty face in the ballroom. Victoria struggled against John's grip, trying to speak, trying to interrupt, trying to reassert a control that no longer existed. John held her firm, not out of care, but out of calculation. His eyes were locked on Helen now, dark and unreadable, his mind running through every interaction, every coffee she'd served, every meeting she'd been present for, every document she might have seen. The math was adding up now. And the sum was catastrophic. Helen's gaze found Victoria's. The two women looked at each other across 3 feet of marble and 3 years of carefully maintained fiction, the mistress and the maid, the predator and the prey, the woman who had everything and the woman who had been treated like nothing. You invited me here to humiliate me, Victoria. Helen's voice dropped, not in volume, but in register. Deeper. Quieter. The voice of a woman delivering a truth she had carried for 1,000 days and had finally earned the right to set down. But all you've done is expose yourself. Victoria flinched. Physically flinched, a full-body contraction, as if the words had made contact with something vital. You thought I was beneath you. You thought I was powerless. You treated me like I was invisible while I documented every crime, every dirty deal, every threat you and your husband made. Each phrase landed like a blow. Not wild, not angry, precise. The precision of a woman who had spent 3 years sharpening each word against the whetstone of patience, waiting for the exact moment to use them. Every dinner party. Every phone call. Every hushed conversation in the study while I poured coffee and you forgot I had ears. Helen paused. Let the silence build until it pressed against the walls of the ballroom like something physical. I didn't come here tonight as your maid. The emerald gown caught the light. The Montgomery diamonds blazed. I came here as the woman who's going to watch your empire burn. The words detonated. Not loudly, Helen Montgomery didn't do loudly. They detonated the way truth detonates, quietly, completely, with a finality that leaves no room for argument, no space for denial, no crack through which the old reality might crawl back in and pretend things are still the way they were. Camera flashes erupted like lightning across the ballroom. Phones that had been discreetly recording were now held high, openly, shamelessly, capturing the moment with the collective understanding that whatever was happening right now was going to matter beyond this room, beyond this night, beyond the careful boundaries of Manhattan society gossip. This was history. Raw, unscripted, and uncontainable. Victoria crumpled. Not dramatically, not the way she did things, not with the theatrical flair she brought to charity galas and museum openings. She crumpled actually. The way a structure crumples when the thing holding it up is removed. Her knees softened. Her shoulders curved inward. The sob that came from her throat was ugly, wet, broken, stripped of every layer of refinement and performance she had ever applied to herself. Mascara ran in dark rivers. Pearls from her damaged updo scattered across the floor. The cream Oscar de la Renta, the dress she had chosen to wear on the night she planned to humiliate a woman in a discount store outfit, now looked like a costume. A costume for a role she could no longer play. John Gotti's face hardened. Not into anger. Into something colder. Something mathematical. His eyes left Helen for the first time and swept the room, the exits, the security personnel, the faces of his lieutenants and associates scattered across the ballroom. Helen watched him calculate. Watched the machinery of survival engage behind his eyes, decades of instinct, decades of reading rooms and identifying threats and finding the door before the door closed. but the doors were already closed. He just didn't know it yet. Helen's eyes returned to the ballroom entrance. The grand double doors through which she had walked minutes ago in emerald and sapphire and 30 years of collected fury. She nodded. The gesture was small. Almost imperceptible. A slight dip of her chin, the kind of movement that most people in the room wouldn't notice, the kind of movement that a maid might make when acknowledging an instruction, the kind of movement that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't waiting for it. Agent Sarah Daniels, standing near the orchestra in her midnight blue gown, saw it. She touched her earpiece. And spoke 2 words. "We're go." I know you're dying to see what happens next. If you're loving this suspense, check the pinned comment and the story description to support the channel. The doors didn't open. They erupted. Both sides of the grand double entrance swung inward simultaneously, not with the measured elegance of hotel staff ushering guests, but with the controlled, deliberate force of people who had been waiting on the other side for a very long time and were now, finally, done waiting. They came through in waves. The first wave was the ballroom perimeter, agents positioned at every service exit, every kitchen entrance, every emergency corridor that John Gotti's men might know about. Doors that had been unguarded moments ago were suddenly blocked by men and women in dark suits, badges catching the chandelier light like small, cold stars. The exits sealed in under 8 seconds. Every one. Simultaneously. The precision of it was almost beautiful, a choreography rehearsed in FBI field offices and executed in a ballroom that smelled like orchids and panic. The second wave was the interior. The bartender with the military haircut stepped out from behind the bar, his apron already on the floor, his badge already in his hand. The woman in the silver evening gown near the east wall opened her clutch, not for lipstick but for the Federal shield and the Glock 19 that had been pressed against satin lining all evening. The 3 men in tuxedos at the service exits produced handcuffs from their jacket pockets with the fluid efficiency of magicians performing a trick they'd done 1,000 times. 17 agents. All moving at once. All converging on the center of the room with the quiet, relentless certainty of water filling a basin. Agent Sarah Daniels walked to the orchestra stage. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room was already frozen, 300 people caught between the instinct to run and the dawning realization that there was nowhere to run to. Daniels stepped up to the microphone, adjusted at once, and raised her badge above her shoulder with her left hand. The shield caught the light and threw it across the nearest table like a tiny, official sunrise. Her voice was calm. Professional. The voice of a woman who had spent 11 months coordinating this operation and was not going to waste the moment by shouting. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Sarah Daniels with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words landed on the ballroom like a net. Nobody leaves this room. Chaos broke. It didn't build, it broke, the way a dam breaks, all at once and in every direction. A woman at table 6 screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered against the crystal chandeliers and rained down on the guests like glass. A man near the bar bolted for the east exit and was met by 2 agents who materialized from the crowd like they'd been grown from the marble floor. He stopped. Stared at their badges. His hands went up slowly, his Rolex glinting as his wrists rose above his shoulders. Chairs scraped. Tables jolted. Champagne glasses toppled in cascading dominoes of crystal and gold liquid. A senator's wife grabbed her husband's arm and hissed something that sounded like "I told you, I told you, I told you." A photographer, the one from page 6 who had been capturing society arrivals all evening, kept shooting, his camera now documenting something far more valuable than fashion. John Gotti moved. He moved the way he always moved, deliberately, without visible panic, his body angling toward the northwest service corridor that led to the kitchen, then to the loading dock, then to a black sedan that was always parked with the engine running for exactly this kind of contingency. 40 years of survival instinct compressed into a single, fluid motion toward the door. He made it 11 steps. 2 agents intercepted him, not with drama, not with drawn weapons, but with the quiet, immovable authority of men who had studied his escape routes for months and had positioned themselves accordingly. One agent stepped into his path. The other appeared behind him. The corridor was blocked. The sedan outside was already surrounded. The driver was already in handcuffs, his face pressed against the steering wheel of a car that was going nowhere. John Gotti. The agent's voice was steady, almost respectful, the way you address a building before you demolish it. You're under arrest for racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs closed around John Gotti's wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. His face remained granite, that famous, unreadable mask that had stared down prosecutors and rivals and frightened men across conference tables for decades. But his eyes, those dark, calculating eyes, found Helen across the ballroom. And in them, for the first time in 40 years of organized crime, was the unmistakable recognition of a man who had been beaten by someone he never saw coming. The arrests unfolded like choreography. Tommy Salerno, gold pinky ring, nervous laugh, handler of things no one discussed in complete sentences, was handcuffed at table 3, his napkin still tucked into his collar. Caruso, the oldest lieutenant, was pulled from his chair so gently it almost looked like assistance, until the steel clicked around his wrists. DeLuca went next. Then Bianchi. One by one, the names Helen had memorized in John's study, the names she had catalogued over 3 years of coffee service and invisible observation, were spoken aloud by federal agents who knew them as well as she did. Anthony Caruso, you're under arrest. Michael DeLuca, you're under arrest. Vincent Bianchi. The litany continued. Systematic. Relentless. Each arrested domino toppling into the next, each handcuff closing with the same clean, metallic finality. The dirty cops went next. 3 of them, seated at different tables, wearing tuxedos over badges they had betrayed. They were led out not through the grand entrance but through the service corridors, a small mercy that spared them the photographers. Or perhaps not a mercy at all, perhaps just efficiency. The FBI had a schedule to keep. Councilman Ferraro was arrested mid-protest. This is outrageous, I have immunity, I have connections. His connections were being handcuffed at the table behind him. Judge Patterson went quietly, his face the color of old ash, his career ending not with a ruling but with a reading of rights. The money launderers, the fixers, the men who had cleaned the gaudy fortune through car washes and construction firms and charitable foundations, all of them, collected like debts coming due. Victoria Gotti lay on the floor. Not metaphorically. She was on the marble, the same marble Helen had polished every morning for 3 years, her cream gown splayed around her like a surrender flag, her body curled into itself, her sobs echoing through the emptying ballroom with the raw, ugly honesty of a woman who had finally run out of performance. The updo was destroyed. The Louboutins had come off, one near table 2, the other somewhere under the orchestra stage. Mascara stained the floor beneath her face in dark, wet Rorschach patterns that looked, from a distance, like bruises. 2 agents knelt beside her. Professional. Not cruel. Not kind. Just precise. Victoria Gotti, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Victoria's sob broke into something sharper, a gasp, a hiccup, the sound of a woman hearing words she had always believed were meant for other people. People beneath her. People like Helen. Helen stood at the center of the ballroom. The eye of the hurricane. The still point around which everything moved. Agents swept past her. Handcuffed guests were escorted toward exits. Evidence teams entered through side doors carrying cases and cameras and the systematic tools of a prosecution that would take years to complete but had been won, effectively, in the last 7 minutes. She hadn't moved from the spot where she'd delivered her speech. The emerald gown still caught the light. The Montgomery diamonds still blazed. Her posture was still flawless, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes steady. But something in her expression had shifted. The composure was still there, but beneath it, visible only to someone who knew where to look, was the faintest tremor of relief. The kind of relief that comes not from victory but from arrival, the sensation of reaching a destination you've been walking toward for so long you'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stop. Agent Daniels approached her, heels clicking against marble, a thick manila folder in her hands. 3 years of documentation, Daniels said, her voice carrying through the ballroom for the remaining guests and journalists to hear. Photographed financial ledgers. Recorded phone conversations. Transcribed meetings. Detailed notes on criminal operations spanning racketeering, extortion, money laundering, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. She opened the folder. Pages and pages, Helen's handwriting, Helen's photographs, Helen's meticulous, invisible, 3-year architecture of justice. Every conversation at every dinner party. Every phone call overheard through the study door. Every document photographed with a camera hidden in a cleaning caddy. Daniels paused, and something that wasn't quite a smile but was close, respect, maybe, or wonder, crossed her face. All of it admissible. All of it devastating. The remaining guests, the ones who weren't in handcuffs, the ones whose names hadn't appeared in Helen's ledgers, stared at the folder, then at Helen, then at each other. The understanding moved through them slowly, like dawn. They were looking at a woman who had scrubbed floors and served champagne and endured 3 years of casual cruelty, not because she had to, but because justice required it. Because some missions demand everything, including your pride. Including your name. Including the daily, grinding humiliation of being treated as less than human by people who never bothered to wonder if you were more. The crowd didn't applaud. This wasn't that kind of moment. But the silence that filled the ballroom was something richer than applause, it was recognition. The recognition of sacrifice. The recognition of courage so quiet it had been mistaken for submission. Victoria was lifted from the floor by 2 agents. Her legs barely held her. Her face was swollen, streaked, unrecognizable from the woman who had stood in this same spot 2 hours ago barking orders about ice sculptures and the vulgarity of brass instruments before dinner. As the agents guided her toward the exit, she turned her head. Found Helen. Their eyes met across the distance, across 3 years of hold the bottle by the base and do try not to embarrass yourself and every small, daily cruelty Victoria had dispensed like breath, automatic and unconsidered. Victoria's voice was a whisper. Broken. Stripped of everything except the one question she couldn't stop herself from asking. Why? Why would you do this? Helen looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, she saw Victoria not as the villain of her story but as a woman. A woman who had married power and mistaken it for love, who had built a life on cruelty and called it culture, who had never once considered that the people she stepped on might be standing on something she couldn't see. The moment passed. My mother's name was Grace Montgomery. Victoria's swollen eyes blinked. The name registered, not immediately, not with the speed of someone who recognized it, but with the slow, creeping horror of someone who was beginning to. She was a civil rights attorney. Brilliant. Brave. She was building a case against her organization, against the extortion of black-owned businesses in Harlem and Brooklyn. She was going to win. Helen's voice didn't waver. Didn't crack. Each word was placed with the same precision she had used to photograph ledgers and memorize account numbers and serve coffee to men who planned violence over breakfast. Your husband had her killed. November 1989. A street corner in Harlem. They called it a mugging. They closed the case in 6 weeks. Victoria's face, what was left of it beneath the mascara and the devastation, went white. Not the white of her usual complexion. The white of someone watching a door open onto something they can never close. I was 8 years old. The words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into deep water. I came to your house not for work, Victoria. Helen held her gaze. Steady. Unblinking. 30 years of grief compressed into a single, unwavering look. I came for justice. And tonight, justice finally came for you. Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The agents turned her toward the door, and she went, not struggling, not screaming, not performing. Just going. A woman being led out of a life that had ended while she was still standing in it. The ballroom emptied slowly. Agents photographed evidence. Journalists scribbled in notebooks. Society reporters who had arrived expecting to cover a charity gala were now covering the largest organized crime prosecution in a decade. The ice sculptures, the realistic swans Victoria had demanded, were melting under the chandelier heat, water pooling on the buffet tables, dripping onto the marble floor in soft, steady drops that sounded, in the emptying room, like a clock winding down. Helen walked toward the exit. She moved through the ballroom one last time, past the tables where she had served dinner, past the bar where she had poured drinks, past the exact spot on the marble where Victoria had lunged at her with a champagne flute and missed. The sapphire train whispered behind her, sweeping across the floor she had polished so many times she knew its surface by heart. At the grand double doors, she paused. Looked back. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, the cathedral of excess, the stage Victoria had built for cruelty, the room where Manhattan's elite had gathered to watch a maid be humiliated, was nearly empty now. Overturned glasses. Abandoned plates. Scattered pearls from Victoria's destroyed updo, still rolling slowly across the marble like tiny, lost planets searching for an orbit that no longer existed. Helen looked at the room for 3 seconds. Then she turned away. She didn't need it anymore. Richard Montgomery was waiting in the lobby. He stood near the entrance, away from the cameras and the commotion, his charcoal suit slightly rumpled, his hands clasped in front of him, his face carrying an expression that was impossible to name because it contained too many things at once: pride, grief, relief, love, exhaustion, and the particular pain of a man watching his daughter complete a mission that should never have been necessary. His cheeks were wet. He didn't wipe them. Helen saw him from across the lobby. The emerald gown. The diamonds. The sapphire train trailing behind her like a river returning to its source. She crossed the marble floor, past FBI agents, past journalists, past hotel staff frozen in bewildered clusters, and when she reached her father, she didn't speak. She walked into his arms. Richard's hands closed around his daughter's shoulders, gently, carefully, as if she were something that had been away for a very long time and might, if held too tightly, disappear again. He pressed his face into her hair. His body shook once, a single, deep tremor that moved through him like a fault line releasing decades of pressure. Grace, he whispered. Not to Helen. To the woman who wasn't there. To the woman who was everywhere. Grace, she did it. Our girl did it. Helen closed her eyes. Pressed her face against her father's chest. Let the tears come, finally, after 3 years of steady hands and unreadable expressions and yes, Mrs. Gotti and photographing ledgers in the dark and being invisible and being patient and being everything she needed to be except herself. She cried. Not the delicate, cinematic tears of a woman in a $5 million gown. The real kind. The kind that comes from a place so deep it doesn't have a name, the place where an 8-year-old girl still sits on the top stair in butterfly pajamas, watching her mother walk out the door for the last time. Around them, cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions. The lobby buzzed with the electric chaos of a story breaking in real time. Helen and Richard stood in the center of it all, holding each other, and heard none of it. They were listening to something older. Something quieter. The sound of a promise, kept. 3 months later, the courtroom smelled like wood polish and finality. The Southern District of New York Federal Courthouse, the same building where Grace Montgomery had once argued cases with a fire that made judges lean forward and opposing counsel lean back, was standing room only. Every bench filled. Every aisle lined with people who had waited decades for this morning. Journalists crammed into the press gallery, notebooks open, pens ready, cameras prohibited but phones smuggled in anyway because some moments refused to go unrecorded. John Gotti stood when the judge spoke. He stood the way he had always stood, straight, composed, granite-faced, his hands clasped behind his back as if the handcuffs were an accessory he'd chosen rather than a consequence he'd earned. 40 years of ruling an empire from the shadows. 40 years of making men disappear, of buying judges, of turning neighborhoods into revenue streams and families into collateral damage. 40 years, and it ended with a sentence read by a woman in black robes who didn't raise her voice because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. Life without parole. The courtroom exhaled. Someone in the gallery sobbed, not from grief, but from the particular release that comes when a weight you've carried so long you'd forgotten its shape is finally, irrevocably, lifted. Victoria's sentencing came 3 weeks later. She arrived in prison-issued clothing that fit the way discount fabric fits everyone, poorly, indifferently, without interest in the body beneath it. Her hair, unstyled for the first time anyone could remember, hung flat against her shoulders. No Valentino. No Louboutins. No champagne flute held at the perfect angle. 25 years. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. Accessory to racketeering. She didn't scream. She didn't lunge. She simply stood, received the sentence, and was led away through a side door that locked behind her with a sound nothing like the grand double doors of the Plaza Hotel. The trial's revelations unspooled over weeks like thread pulled from a garment that had looked pristine from the outside but was rotting underneath. 47 individual charges across 19 defendants. Exposed, a network of extortion that had strangled black-owned businesses across Harlem and Brooklyn for over 2 decades. Exposed, 3 sitting officials who had accepted payments from the Gotti organization in exchange for zoning approvals, dropped investigations, and strategic blindness. Exposed, 2 NYPD officers who had actively suppressed evidence in cases involving Gotti-linked violence, including, the prosecution revealed in a moment that silenced the courtroom for 11 seconds, the 1989 murder investigation of civil rights attorney Grace Montgomery. The case file had been deliberately buried. Witnesses had been threatened. Evidence had been misrouted. The detective assigned, long since retired to a gated community in Boca Raton, was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning in January, still in his bathrobe, coffee growing cold on the counter as agents read him his rights. Random. Tragic. Case closed. Not anymore. For wrongful convictions were overturned within the first 60 days. Business owners who had been framed by the Gotti organization, charged with tax evasion, code violations, crimes fabricated from whole cloth to punish noncompliance, walked out of courtrooms as free men and women. A barber from 125th Street named Marcus Williams, the same man whose name had been circled in red on John Gotti's map, stood on the courthouse steps and wept openly, holding a piece of paper that said the government owed him an apology and $1.2 million in reparations. "I lost my shop," he said to the cameras, his voice cracking. "I lost 11 years. But today I got something back that's worth more than any of it." He paused. Steadied himself. "I got the truth." The communities began to heal the way communities do, not all at once, not with grand gestures, but with small, accumulating acts of restoration that looked, from a distance, like ordinary life. A bakery on Fulton Street reopened. A community center in Brownsville received an anonymous donation large enough to fund after-school programs for 3 years. A group of business owners in Harlem formed a coalition, the Grace Montgomery Business Alliance, dedicated to supporting Black entrepreneurs and ensuring that no family would face the kind of organized predation the goddess had perfected. The name Grace Montgomery, which had been erased from public memory for 30 years, was being spoken aloud again. In courtrooms. In community meetings. In newspaper headlines. In the mouths of people who had never met her but who understood, now, what she had fought for and what it had cost. Helen watched it all. And then she built. The Grace Montgomery Foundation was announced on a clear morning in February, on the steps of the same federal courthouse where her mother had once argued cases. The podium was simple, no crystal chandeliers, no ice sculptures, no gold-embossed invitations. Just a microphone, a woman, and a purpose. Richard Montgomery stood behind his daughter. He had emerged from seclusion for the first time in 34 years, thinner, older, his hair silver where it had once been black, but his eyes sharp and alive in a way they hadn't been since 1989. He wore a simple navy suit. No fashion empire. No cameras he'd sought. Just a father, standing where his wife once stood, watching his daughter carry the torch forward. The crowd gathered below the steps was enormous. Former victims of gaudy extortion. Community leaders from Harlem and Brooklyn. Civil rights attorneys who had read about Grace's case and traveled from across the country to be present. FBI agents, including Sarah Daniels, in a dark suit and sensible shoes, looking more comfortable than she ever had in an evening gown. Journalists. Supporters. Strangers who had seen Helen's photograph, the one in the emerald gown, the one that had gone viral the night of the gala, the one that had become something larger than a picture of a woman in a dress, and had been moved to show up. Helen stood at the microphone wearing simple black. A fitted dress, elegant but unadorned. No diamonds. No sapphire train. No $5 million statement. Just black, her mother's favorite color. The color Grace wore to court. The color of the robes in the photograph Helen had kept face down in a drawer for 3 years and now carried, framed, in her hands. She set the photograph on the podium. Faced the crowd. And spoke. The Grace Montgomery Foundation will provide free legal aid to families affected by organized crime. It will fund witness protection advocacy, support undercover operatives who risk everything for justice, and establish programs in communities that have been terrorized by criminal organizations, communities that were told to be quiet, to pay up, to accept their place. Her voice was steady. Clear. The voice of a woman who had learned that silence could be a weapon, but who had also learned that some silences must eventually be broken. My mother didn't get to finish her fight. She was murdered for believing that the law could protect the powerless from the powerful. She was killed for refusing to be quiet. Helen paused. Looked down at the photograph. Grace's face, caught in mid-stride on these very steps, briefcase in hand, natural hair crowned against the sky. But she was right. The law can protect. Justice can arrive. It just sometimes takes longer than it should. She looked up. Found her father's eyes. Found Agent Daniels. Found the faces of strangers who had become, through shared suffering and shared hope, something like family. My mother taught me that real power isn't about fear or money. It's about truth. The crowd was silent. Listening. Holding the moment the way hands hold something fragile and precious. And tonight, she stopped. Corrected herself. Smiled for the first time, a small, private smile meant for a woman who wasn't there. And today, the truth won. The crowd erupted. Not the polite applause of charity galas. Not the performative enthusiasm of society events. Real sound, clapping and cheering and weeping, and the full-throated roar of people who had been waiting for someone to say what Helen just said and mean it. Marcus Williams, the barber, stood in the front row with tears streaming down his face, clapping so hard his palms ached. Agent Daniels nodded once, that soldier's nod, and looked away to compose herself. Richard Montgomery placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder and left it there, steadying her, steadying himself, steadying the legacy they were rebuilding together on the bones of the one that had been stolen. The image of Helen in the emerald gown became iconic. It appeared on magazine covers. On murals in Harlem. On protest signs carried by communities fighting corruption in cities that had never heard the gaudy name but recognized the story of power abused and power reclaimed, of invisibility weaponized, of a woman who was underestimated until she was undeniable. A best-selling book followed. Then a documentary. The Plaza Hotel, after considerable internal deliberation, installed a small bronze plaque in the Grand Ballroom, in honor of the night Justice wore emerald and sapphire, and the woman who wore it for her mother. Victoria Gotti learned about the plaque from a television in the common room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. She watched the segment in silence, surrounded by women who didn't know her name and didn't care, wearing clothes she didn't choose in a room she couldn't leave. The letters she sent to former friends came back unopened. Every one. The charities she had co-chaired removed her name from their donor walls within weeks of the arrest. The museum board issued a statement so carefully worded it said nothing at all. Her children, 3 of them, all adults, petitioned the court to legally change their surnames. The judge approved the request without comment. The world Victoria built, the world of cream Valentinos and gold-embossed invitations and champagne held at the perfect angle, didn't collapse. It evaporated. The way power always evaporates when the truth beneath it is finally exposed, quickly, completely, as if it had never been solid to begin with. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in March, Helen drove to Westchester. The cemetery was empty except for the groundskeeper, who tipped his hat and said nothing. Helen walked the path she had walked 100 times, past the old oaks, past the iron gate, past the rows of stones that stood like sentences in a story no one reads anymore, until she reached the one that mattered. Grace Eleanor Montgomery. 1954 to 1989. Beloved mother. Fearless advocate. The truth was her weapon. Helen knelt on the grass. It was soft, early spring, new growth, the kind of green that promises something. She placed a bouquet of white lilies against the stone. Grace's favorite. The flowers she'd kept on her desk in the brownstone, the ones that made the whole hallway smell like hope. Helen pressed her palm flat against the cold granite. Closed her eyes. Let the silence hold her the way silence does in places where love has been buried but not lost. We did it, Mama. Her voice was quiet. Not a whisper, she was done whispering. Just quiet, the way you speak to someone who is listening from very close by. It took time. It took longer than it should have. But we did it. She opened her eyes. Traced the letters of her mother's name with her fingertip. Felt the grooves in the stone, each one carved with the same permanence Grace had brought to everything she touched, her cases, her family, her refusal to look away from injustice even when injustice looked back with intent to kill. They know your name now, Mama. They know what you fought for. They know what they took. A bird sang somewhere in the oaks. The wind moved through the branches with a sound like pages turning. And they know what your daughter did about it. Helen stood. Brushed the grass from her knees. Looked at the headstone one more time, the name, the dates, the words etched beneath them. Words that had once felt like an epitaph and now felt like a beginning. She turned and walked back toward the car, where her father waited with the engine running and the passenger window down and the expression of a man who had finally, after 34 years, exhaled. The following Tuesday, Helen stood on the steps of the federal courthouse. Not for a press conference. Not for a foundation event. Just to stand there. Just to feel the stone beneath her feet and the sun on her face and the knowledge that her mother had climbed these same steps hundreds of times, briefcase in hand, head high, natural hair crowned against the sky, walking toward a fight she believed in with every cell of her body. The morning was overcast. Gray clouds hung low over lower Manhattan, pressing down on the skyline like a ceiling that might never lift. Helen stood on the top step, wearing simple black, her mother's photograph in her hands, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt the weight of everything. The 3 years of silence. The 30 years of grief. The daily humiliations absorbed. The coffee poured for men who planned violence. The floor scrubbed for a woman who treated her like furniture. The name she abandoned. The life she delayed. The tears she held until her chest ached from the holding. All of it. And then the clouds broke. Not slowly. Not gradually. They broke the way truth breaks through silence, suddenly, completely, as if the sky had been waiting for permission and had finally received it. Sunlight poured through the gap and struck the courthouse steps in a wide, golden column that lit the stone and the woman standing on it with the kind of radiance that doesn't feel accidental. It felt chosen. It felt like someone, somewhere above the skyline, was saying, "I see you. I've always seen you. And I am so proud." Helen lifted her face to the light. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there, on the steps where Grace Montgomery once fought, in the city where Grace Montgomery was silenced, wearing the color Grace Montgomery loved, and let the sun find her. A woman who had been invisible for 3 years. A woman who had been grieving for 30. A woman who had traded her name, her comfort, her identity, and her pride for the chance to stand in this exact spot, on this exact morning, carrying this exact truth, that the people who are overlooked are often the ones paying the closest attention. That patience is not weakness. That silence is not surrender. That the maid who pours your coffee might be memorizing your crimes. That the woman you dismiss might be the one who dismantles everything you built. That those who are underestimated hold the most dangerous kind of power, the kind you never see coming until it's already arrived. Helen Montgomery looked out over the city. Her mother's city. Her city now. Then she descended the steps, walked into the morning light, and kept going, carrying Grace's legacy forward, one steady, unhurried, undeniable step at a time. The crowd at the bottom of the steps parted to let her through. Not because she asked them to. Because some people don't have to ask. They just walk, and the world makes room. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.